You know that moment. It's probably one of the most familiar scenes in American Christianity, the altar call. It's that deeply personal invitation at the end of a sermon. And, it feels like it's been around forever, right? Well, its origins might just surprise you. So, picture this. You're in a packed auditorium, maybe a church. The sermon has just hit this emotional peak. The music starts to swell, really soft, and the preacher steps forward, looks out at everyone, and makes an invitation. And there it is, that phrase. It's all designed to create this very specific atmosphere, doesn't it? It's supposed to be a private decision, but in a very public space. You're being asked to make what could be the most important choice of your entire life. It's become this really powerful cultural moment. But here's the question. Was it always this way? I mean, can you imagine the Apostle Paul ending one of his sermons with an altar call? The short answer? No. This whole practice is actually much, much newer than most people think. So if it didn't come from the early church, where did it come from? Well, the modern altar call doesn't just have roots, it has an inventor. The entire practice, as we know it, can pretty much be traced back to one single transformative figure in American history. Let me introduce you to Charles Finney. Now, Finney wasn't your typical seminary-trained theologian. Nope, he was a lawyer, and he brought a lawyer's way of thinking to everything he did, including revivals. He really believed that a spiritual conversion could be won, just like a court case, if you just use the right techniques of persuasion. This idea right here, it was absolutely radical for its time. Finney basically argued that a revival isn't some mysterious miracle that God sends down from heaven. He said it's a predictable, almost scientific outcome. For him, conversion wasn't so much a divine gift as it was a human achievement, something you could produce with the right methods, all because he believed people naturally had the ability to choose God. So to get this result, Finney developed what he called his new measures. Things like the anxious bench. That's a seat right at the front where people feeling convicted were pressured to go sit. It's the direct ancestor of today's altar call. He held these long, multi-day meetings designed to just ramp up the emotional intensity until people finally gave in. He would even call people out by name from the pulpit. It was all about creating this intense psychological environment where saying yes was simply the path of least resistance. Now, Finney's methods were, let's just say, controversial, but they seemed to work. They drew huge crowds and got big emotional responses. And because of that success, they didn't just disappear. Instead, they were picked up, they were polished, and they were passed down through generations of evangelists. So over the next 100 years or so, the method evolved. You had D.L. Moody, who made it a little less confrontational with his inquiry room. Then comes Billy Sunday, a former baseball player, who turns the whole thing into a spectacle. And finally, of course, Billy Graham, who perfected the method for the modern era, bringing it to millions on TV. You can literally trace a straight line from this controversial 19th century lawyer to some of the most respected evangelists of the 20th century. By the time you get to Billy Graham, this thing is a highly efficient, well-oiled machine. You've got the sermon that builds and builds to one single point of decision. You've got that iconic hymn, Just As I Am, creating the perfect atmosphere. Then there's the invitation, the trained counselors, the little decision card you fill out. The presentation was incredibly polished, but the core theology, inherited directly from Finney, was exactly the same. Conversion is, at its heart, a human decision. And this brings us from the history of the method to the theology that actually drives it. Because the altar call isn't just a practice, it's built on a very specific answer to a huge question. Who converts whom? The theology behind it all is called synergism. It comes from the Greek for working together. And it basically assumes that, yeah, the Holy Spirit does his part, but the final decisive factor, that's your choice. God presents the offer, but you have to be the one to accept it. Your will cooperates with God's will. But there's a historic counter-theology to this, and it's called monergism, which means God alone works. And it paints a starkly different picture. Synergism says the human will is just weakened by sin, but it can still make that choice. Monergism says no, the will is spiritually dead. It's completely unable to choose God, any more than a corpse can choose to be resurrected. This quote from the Lutheran Confessions really lays out the monergistic view, and just listen to how comprehensive it is. Utterly unable, entirely dead. From this perspective, faith isn't a decision we make. It's a gift that God literally creates inside of us. After all, dead people don't cooperate in their own resurrection. Now, critics of the altar call method point to what they see as a really big theological problem. It often starts with the law. You're a sinner. Okay, then it moves to the gospel. Christ died for you. Great. But then step 3 takes this amazing good news and twists it back into a new law. Now you must act. And just like that, the free gift of the gospel suddenly becomes another task you have to perform, a conditional offer that depends on you. Okay, so if conversion isn't a human decision, then how in the world does it happen? Well, this alternative theological framework says that God delivers faith to people through tangible external things. They're called the means of grace. The belief is that the Holy Spirit actually creates faith through the hearing of the preached word, through the water of baptism, through the Lord's Supper, and through the spoken word of forgiveness. Now, the key here is that the action is happening outside of you and is being delivered to you rather than starting inside of you as a decision. And the clearest, most powerful illustration of this God alone theology is probably infant baptism. It really is the ultimate test case for this whole debate. I mean, think about it for a second. A baby cannot cooperate. A baby can't make a conscious decision to accept anything. So if faith is being created in that moment of baptism, who is the one doing all the work? It has to be God, right? And that's the logical conclusion of this whole line of thought. From this perspective, infant baptism isn't some weird exception to the rule. It's the purest expression of the belief that salvation is entirely God's work, from beginning to end. So, why does any of this matter? Why does a theological debate from centuries ago still have any bearing on us today? Well, it all comes down to a very personal question. Where do you find your certainty, your assurance of salvation? Because these two theologies give two very different answers. In decision theology, your assurance is based on something you did, the memory of your decision. So when you have doubts, what are you told? Think back to that moment you accepted Jesus. The focus is inward, on your sincerity, on your feelings. But in the other view, assurance is based on something God did, his objective promise given to you in baptism. So when you doubt, you're told to look outward, to that external divine act. You're told you are baptized. So this whole debate over the altar call, it's so much more than just arguing about church methods. It gets to the heart of what faith is, the nature of God's work, and the very ground of our hope. Is your assurance anchored to a moment of your own choosing, or is it anchored to a promise that God made for you? It's a question that's definitely worth thinking about.